teaching in. My name is Chuck DeVore. I'm the Vice President of Policy for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I'm delighted to be here this morning with you to discuss some very important topics for the future of Texas. Our next panel, I think you'll find a very interesting mix of topics and opinions about the way forward for Texas as Texas deals with its rapidly growing population that accompanies its success, its prosperity, as it continues to lead the nation in terms of jobs added and percentage growth in GDP and just all-around success as the Texas model shows the rest of the nation what a low tax rate and a light regulatory burden and lawsuit reform can do to bring prosperity to all people. Our next panel is going to be talking about how we meet the challenges of that future, and it's entitled Laying the Foundation for Texas's Future. We have three very distinguished panelists with us today who will be talking about three very interesting and somewhat related issues as they relate to infrastructure development. First up will be Dr. Keith Phillips. He's going to discuss his research related to the importance of property rights regarding water in Texas. I think that's one of the least understood things about water and the fact that you have kind of an old way of thinking that looks at water and the primacy of rights and yet also treats water kind of as a public asset. And as those of us who appreciate economics and freedom will tell you, if nobody owns something, it's likely to be ignored or abused. And certainly water is extremely important. And, funny thing about water, if you pay for it, it seems to show up. So Dr. Phillips is going to talk about how clear property rights facilitate markets to efficiently allocate water during droughts and in times of plenty. He's going to tell you how a well-functioning water market would be much less costly and more effective than pure government control. Now, Dr. Phillips joined the Federal Reserve in January 1984. He's published numerous economic studies through the Dallas Fed. In fact, the prestigious journal Research Papers in Economics ranks Dr. Phillips in the top 5% of economists around the world in terms of the number of his distinct publications. He attained his PhD in economics from Southern Methodist University and holds both a BA and a master's degree in economics, as well as a bachelor in journalism from the University of Missouri at Columbia. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Dr. Phillips here as soon as we finish with our introductions. We'll next hear from Mr. Richard Alm, who's going to discuss his research on the challenges facing public education in Texas through meaningful reforms instead of simply spending more money on education. He's going to tell you about his research that shows that to better educate Texans, young Texans, there must be more competition. Now, another way of looking at it might be allowing cooperative models instead of coercive models based on an enforced government monopoly. That might be another way of looking at competition. Mr. Alm is a writer in residence at the William J. O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom at SMU, at the SMU Cox School of Business. He's the co-author with W. Michael Cox of Myths of Rich and Poor, published in 1999. He has 25 plus years of experience as a business writer and editor. He covered the national economy while working for U.S. News and World Report in Washington, D.C., and wrote about national and Texas economies and international business, as well as being a reporter and a columnist for the Dallas Morning News. Lastly, we'll be hearing from Dr. John Merrifield, who's going to discuss reforming the appraisal process for property taxes. That's certainly a huge issue in Texas, where Texans pay the 14th highest property tax burden in the country, and clearly the appraisal process is a huge part of that. He's also going to talk about strengthening Texas's tax and expenditure limitations so as to grow the economy more rapidly, all of which then provide a basis for school choice. Dr. Merrifield is a professor of economics at the University of Texas in San Antonio and the editor of the Journal of School Choice. He has published The School Choice Wars, School Choices, Parental Choice as an Education Reform Catalyst, Global Lessons, Basic Economic Tools, as well as 51 other journal articles and several chapters in books on public finance, education economics, urban and regional economics, and environmental and natural resource economics. He teaches a fully online course at the School System Reform, in School System Reform Studies. So interesting that you practice what you preach with that online course. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I'm very delighted to welcome to the podium Dr. Phillips.
Good morning. I'm excited to be here, and I'm thankful to be invited to this program. I think it's a lot of fun and very important to growth in the state's economy. It's also the case that my boss is speaking at lunch, and it's always good to present on the same program as the boss. So I've been with the Dallas Fed for 30 years, but 15 years ago I moved to, they transferred me to the San Antonio branch, and I became interested in water pretty quickly. Water is important not only to the state, but particularly to South Texas. And it was interesting, one of the first panels I served on was a local economic growth type panel, and to the left of me was a person from SAWS, San Antonio Water System, and to the right of me was a person from the Economic Development Department of San Antonio. And the SAWS guy talked about how inexpensive water was in San Antonio and how water rates in the metro area were some of the lowest in the country. And the economic development guy talked about how the scarcity of water is making it difficult to attract businesses to San Antonio. So I was in the middle, like going, what the heck is going on? And there's something wrong here, and what was wrong is called the rule of capture. But we're so used to our products that we buy being allocated through markets that we know that when things are scarce, if there's not a lot of cows being slaughtered, that beef prices go up. And those price increases send important messages to both producers and consumers, and they allocate the resource efficiently. And apparently that wasn't happening with water because supposedly it was very scarce and yet the price was very low. And so it got me interested in water, and I'm not a natural resource economist, I'm a regional economist, but certainly that's something that's very important as we go forward in the state, understanding how water is allocated and how we can more efficiently allocate it. So as we know, there's been a drought in Texas. This is Medina Lake, which is close to San Antonio. It's at 3% of capacity. So if you bought a house there a while back or many years ago and you had lakefront property, you don't have lakefront property anymore. So we know, and this is just one lake, you know, if you're from San Angelo, there's a major lake that's totally dry, and there's a lot of reservoirs that are at very low capacity. Currently, about 80% of Texas is what we call abnormally dry. These are different stages of drought throughout the Texas. East Texas, actually, right now, is doing pretty well in terms of moisture conditions. But 2011, we saw one of the most severe droughts in the state. By some conditions, it was the worst since the 50s. By other measures, it was the worst since records were created in the late 1880s. And in recent years, we've seen continued arid weather. So one of the things I've done here in just this brief presentation is it's really important because of the way the laws are in the state. There's a big difference between surface water and groundwater. Surface waters are ruled by different rules, but surface water supplies are drying up throughout a lot of areas of the state, as I said, and Medina's at 3%. The Twin Buttes Reservoir in San Angelo is totally dry. And we're going to continue to see many issues with reservoirs across the state. As we go forward and we look forward, as we know, Texas has been very successful in terms of its economic growth, and it continues to attract more and more residents. So we're going to see a continuing increase in our population and economic activity driving up water demand. As we look forward and we look at usage of water, the water supply is projected to drop, so we're going to see more and more issues concerning water. So who uses water? Agriculture accounts for about 60% of the water use in the state, and that's a very important thing right there. Municipalities use 27%. The remainder is broken up into manufacturing and utilities and energy. There's been a lot of discussion about the use of water in terms of energy production in the state, mostly because that's done in rural areas, often areas that don't have a lot of water supply, but energy uses 1% of the state's water supply. So if we look at surface water, it accounts for about 40%. This is mostly reservoirs, lakes, and streams. Surface water accounts for about 40% of Texas water supply, but 62% of the water for metro areas. So metro areas depend heavily on surface water. While the state technically owns surface water, private property rights to its use are pretty well defined. The laws surrounding that allocate water pretty efficiently in terms of the laws behind it on who owns the water in streams and lakes. Some of the more well-efficient functioning markets exist in some areas of the state, although not all areas, actually not most areas. But the lower Rio Grande Valley has had a pretty efficient water market in place for quite a while. And while that area has been booming in population, it has not really built any new reservoirs for a long time, and water prices adjust to supply and demand conditions there. Some of the challenge for surface water markets, for markets in surface water is that 23 water authorities own about 70% of surface water rights. So you have agencies like the Lower Colorado River Authority that own a lot of the water rights for that basin, and this creates a problem for markets. When you think about efficient markets, you need lots of buyers and sellers who interact to set the price. And in the future, we want to kind of move toward more more private property right owners and not fewer. Within the rules regarding surface water, we have things like take or pay contracts. So a river authority will tell a city or a metro water agency that you pay for the water whether you use it or not. Obviously, that gives incentive to use it. And there's a lot of inefficiency in these types of things. And often water is over-allocated. So if everyone uses the water, there's not enough. Okay, so this is an example of the Lower Colorado River Authority. Last couple of years, you may have read this if you're from Austin, is that they've been running into some scarcity, so they've cut the usage of water to agriculture, primarily rice farmers along the Gulf Coast. So in 2011, if you look at their water usage of their water that they're in charge of, 60% went to agriculture. But in 2012, that was reduced to 21%. This was not done through markets. This was done because the Lower Colorado River Authority just said you don't get the water. Now, it may seem good. Everyone might say, well, why we have rice farming in a state where we have tight water conditions? And that's fine. The problem is maybe it's easy to tell rice farmers you don't get any water. Not so easy to tell a city along the coast, Austin's more important than you are, or to tell traditional farmers such as cotton farmers you don't get any water. So the problem is you have someone telling somebody else who gets what. When markets can decide that, if scarcity increases, the price of water, if these rice owners, I think there's approximately 350 of them, each had rights to water, I think it's pretty clear they would sell water in shortage times to the city of Austin. And that would result in more efficiency. And it would result in all kinds of great incentives that markets give us. What we want to move toward is more markets for water. How much time do I have? 5? Okay. Who's signaling? Okay, good. Now I know who to look. Okay. If we move to groundwater, groundwater accounts for 60% of Texas water supply and 80% of water going to agriculture. Aquifers are often very large. If you're familiar with the Edwards Aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer in West Texas, they cover a lot of ground. And a very nice thing about it is you can create markets where transportation of water is very cheap. Essentially, farmers can sell water to cities without actually having pipelines. The farmers withdraw less and the city withdraws more. And that gives great opportunity for markets, even at a low cost. As the cost of water, scarcity increase with scarcity of water increases, prices will increase enough so that pipelines are built. But in terms of aquifer, there is even greater advantage in terms of these large aquifers. But the problem is we have this, some places call it the right of capture. I like to call it the rule of capture. And that regulates groundwater, and it stipulates that water is not owned until it's pumped out of the ground. The problem here is that that results in, obviously, the tragedy of the commons, which is a term likely most of you understand, is that when it's owned by it's a shared ownership, then no one really owns it, and you get very bad incentives. In times of scarcity, you want to pump as much as you can. And you see this happening in that they'll pump water out of the aquifer into a surface water containment. So make sure that their neighbor doesn't pump the water out and they don't get any. Everyone tries to pump as fast as they can. We saw the same thing at the beginning of the oil boom, right? In East Texas, where you see these oil wells going up all over the place, and you try to pull as much out as you can before your neighbor gets it. And it creates very poor incentives. So I did, after I had a water conference in San Antonio, I was asked to go out to Amarillo and give a speech about water, which was kind of intimidating, but it was the first speech I ever gave where I talked about the importance of private property rights, and I was called a communist. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The problem is, if you have water rights to the water, you have to have meters on wells, and people don't like that. But it's a way to secure your right to the water, the certain amount of water. And you have to have private property rights in order to create markets. But anyway, the biggest challenge to groundwater is the rule of capture. When we issue rights, we need lots of buyers and sellers. There are problems. Even Edwards Aquifer Authority has set up a co-op, and other aquifers have, to try to get around the rule of capture, but it's on very shaky legal ground. But some of these things are where you have use it or lose it provisions, where you have to use the water or you lose your right to it. And that's just stupid, because that just creates bad incentives. It's like budgeting. Everybody's at a company that if you don't use your budget, it gets cut next year. You know how you just go on a massive spending spree at the end of the year. But anyway, you have to make sure you do this right. Third-party issues are interesting. They think that if you allow farmers to sell the water, then the towns are going to dry up, and you have to give some compensation to feed stores and such. The problem with that is it assumes that the economy is stagnant, and the economy is always creating and losing jobs. But that's an issue that comes up. Anyway, I need to speed up here a little. So what can we do now? I think the first thing we do is overturn the rule of capture. It's not in the Constitution, which I thought it was. It's a common law rule that was established in 1905 and can easily be legislated away. For surface water, we need to move more buyers and sellers and not fewer. As we go to these big regional plans, we need to make sure there's lots of buyers and sellers and not big agencies that determine who gets water. We need to eliminate or avoid inefficient rules that have bad incentives, and we need to encourage short-term spot markets. So I'm optimistic about the future, actually. You know, the bad thing about the rule of capture is, you know, it sucks. And the good thing about it is it allows us now, if we eliminate it, we can set up really nice rules. We have to have lots of buyers and sellers. So we need some to make, everyone's fear is that they'll have some rich company or people come in and buy all the rights to an area and have a monopoly power over water. So you have to have strong rules so that doesn't happen. You know, 60% of the water in the states is used by agriculture, which represents less than 2% of state GDP, by the way. There's plenty of room for sales of water to thirsty cities and industries. We can grow a lot with the water we have if we allocate it efficiently. You can see if we have spot markets for water, farmers selling their water in terms of shortage periods and letting their fields go fallow for a year or two, and then farming again once water comes back. We just need to have the markets in the place to do that. And currently, there's quite a bit of water around. We don't have pipelines to move water, but if prices get high enough, you will. And I think if you look forward for the state of Texas, and we do things right, water will be more expensive, but we don't have to worry about it not being there. Thank you.
Find this thing. Get that one.
There you go. Perfect. I think you got to do the full screen.
Thing is, I can't
There you go.
see what I'm doing here very well because my glasses are right over here.
Perfect. You got it.
No, we got it. With my faithful assistant here. I want to talk about taking a fresh look at educational spending. Talmadge Heflin was up here a few minutes ago and used the phrase essential services, and I want to give you two postulates on essential services. The first is the more essential the service is considered, the less likely we will question calls for increased spending. And a second postulate would be the more you spend on an essential service, the more ineffective or inefficient that public service is going to be. So with those things in mind, let's talk about education, which many people, and we can debate this question later if you want, whether it's an essential government spending, but I think it is widely considered as such. Okay, just a little commercial first. I've mentioned Dr. Cox, who's my boss at the O'Neill Center, who did most of the quantitative work in this thing, so enough of him. Okay, now, first we want to emphasize that we think that education is good for individuals and it's good for society. The way we usually show this is show that the more years of education people have, the more they earn. And so we should want people to become more educated. So if it's good for individuals and it's good for society, so we should spend more on it. And that's pretty much what you keep hearing about. Now this is just some raw data here that shows two things. State-by-state compendium of spending per student, and an amalgam of 8th grade test scores in math, reading, and science. To simplify things, you could separate them out, but you don't get much of a difference. So you can see that the states, and you have some states are very high spenders, and if you look at New York, and then people look up there and they see New York's among the, I can't see it there because I can't see very well. But anyway, Anyway, people use these two data series to reach the conclusion: if you spend more, you get more education. And the way it usually is told, the story is usually told in this state, is we don't spend very much, and so we get mediocre results in our schools. So, and if you take this and you do a regression about it, and you find that you do get a positive relationship on this data. So, case closed, right? Let's spend more on education. Well, we wanted to take a deeper look at these numbers, and because one thing is there's an inconvenient truth here, and that is that we have been spending more on education for 30 or 40 or 50 years, and we haven't got additional additions in the output of education have been flat or negative. So this is for the nation as a whole. The cost per student, this comes from a guy at Cato Institute who did this. And you see, since 1970, the inflation-adjusted cost of education per pupil has gone up 80%, and you have seen very little action on the test scores. So Dr. Cox and I really liked this view, so we did it for the state of Texas. The best we could do is get data back to 1990, and we did find that there's been a tremendous increase in the inflation-adjusted cost of educating a student, and we have gotten very little. But again, the data on student performance by state is a little harder to find, so this is the best we could do in terms of finding. But there seems to be, in both of these cases, the additional spending has not brought great results. So we asked ourselves why, and we found some fatal flaws in how we measure spending and student performance. First of all, the cost of living varies among states, and so we went back to the original data we had on actual spending per student by state, and we made a cost of living adjustment, very easy to do. And we find that Texas has moves up a little bit because our cost of living is generally kind of low, but we didn't make a spectacular gain in the rankings, but every bit helps. And when we did this for everybody, we found that, for instance, Hawaii, very high cost of living place, turns out that it's actually spending very little on education. But you hear that Mississippi doesn't spend much on education, but in truth, the cost of living after the COLA adjustment, it's Hawaii who's not spending very much on education, which may, I'm sorry, I apologize for this joke, which may explain the person in the White House. Sorry. Anyway, the second flaw in the link between spending and student performance is that demographics vary among states. And this is a more serious problem in the data. So what we did is we looked at the demographic composition of the states, and you go up there at the top. They're ranked by the proportion of white students, so Vermont and Maine and New England basically, and you get down to Hawaii and some of the others, California have large, and Texas down there have large minority populations. One thing you have to know about test scores is that and there's Texas, is they systematically vary among demographic groups. And so that's on the left side there. Whites generally continue to score higher than the little tick marks are the state by state things. So the range for the whites is higher than the range for Hispanics and blacks. And so what we did, we decided how to account for this was to normalize each state's population by the national average of because what we want to find out is how students perform, not whether a state has a large white population or a large minority population. And that's what you get. You've got to separate that out. So we ended up with we decided that we didn't have enough data to look at the other demographic groups. So we just looked at the three main ones, three largest ones. So with varied demographics that's the same data that I showed you before about the 8th grade performance measures. And so when we make demographic composition of each state equal, we end up with a wholly different ranking. Now, one of the states that makes a very significant jump here is Texas, which I think is 28th on the left, and it moves up to 3rd in the nation. So suddenly the story of we're not spending much, instead we're getting bad results. Now we don't have that starts to break down because our results suddenly look a lot better than most people realize. And if you look at the individual demographic groups, Texas is 4th among whites, 8th, I think, or 9th among Hispanics, and 3rd among blacks. And when you put it all together, we end up moving from 28 to 3, and several other states make large jumps in the rankings. Maryland, Arkansas, Delaware, and then some other states that have large white populations: Vermont, Maine, Iowa, Utah. They decline in the rankings because we're not trying to measure what their demographic profile is. We want to know how their schools are doing. So if it's not money, what explains the differences in test scores? In a word, parents. So we ran I say we in a very humorous way, we ran a regression that included we used our COLA adjusted spending and our outputs adjusted for demographics, and we threw in some education of parents and some other things, and the income. There's an income variable in there, cost of living adjusted, and we got very nice, robust results. But what happened was in the earlier regression with just the two variables, we found that spending levels were significant in educational outputs. Here, the school spending variable becomes statistically insignificant, and therefore sort of explains why additional spending has not produced greater results in those two graphs I showed you earlier. And so it turns out that we found that states with more educated parents and with higher incomes, which of course are highly correlated, will have better schools. If not money, then what will improve America's schools? In two words, choice and competition. In the private sector, choice means basically that you allow parents and students to choose their schools, and competition means that you allow schools to compete for students and the money that comes with them. In other words, the money is not attached to the school districts attached to the student. So in private markets, those who, and with choice and competition, those who provide quality product at a good price gain customers and resources. Those who don't fail. So bad school, the economy, resources, and production are constantly reorganized to deliver ever higher quality at ever lower prices. Higher quality, lower prices. Now, when you get to the public sector, government doles out resources to those who need them. Need is determined by performance. If your school is underperforming relative average, then you are tagged as needing more resources, and vice versa. Resources are reshuffled and subsidized to ever lower quality at ever higher prices. And so one of the things, this is just on the left is the graph I showed you earlier. Well, one of the explanations is we're not spending the money on students, we're spending it on the things that administrating, more teachers and things like that. So, and again, this is the same version of the thing we did for Texas. And so, thank you very much.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about those scores is that the best score is still pretty bad. Because the system, the public school system, is designed to be low performing, not intentionally, of course, but through the political process. Okay, so let's see, we just click forward to get to the next presentation.
Yep. Now you have to go down there somewhere there, wherever yours is.
Oops, sorry, I can't see real without my glasses either.
Hey, old men have problems. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I'm darn near 59, so is that old? Okay, yeah.
There you go.
Ah, there we go. Right. Here, I'll get it from here.
Give us that big screen to look at.
Yeah, there's a button at the, okay. All right, I guess I'm the caboose here. Oops, get these glasses off because they look dorky when I don't need them. I guess I'm the caboose here, and I want to leave you with some out-of-the-box concepts, starting with the first one. I'm not interested in in reforming appraisal. I'm interested in ending it. And we have two blue states, of all things, to show the way. California and Oregon have not reappraised property except when it's drastically physically altered in a long time. As a result, they've created strong incentives to rebuild, renovate. I bet fixer-uppers are pretty scarce in those two states except in rundown cities. Because say you buy a $100,000 property because it's beat up looking, you could, but through repairs, fix it up, make it more valuable, and only pay the taxes on the $100,000, even though you may have increased it to be worth $500,000. I can say that from personal example, except I'm here in Texas where they do reappraise, because I did buy a property here for about $140,000 in the late 90s, and now the appraisal district tells me it's worth $500,000, which I couldn't afford to own a $500,000 property. I could only barely afford the property taxes on it. Luckily, I paid cash for the $100,000 back in the late 90s, so I don't have a mortgage payment, at least not on $500,000. So anyway, and reappraisal, that saves about $300 million a year in the Bear Appraisal District and other appraisal district costs across the state. And I guess I'm jumping ahead a little bit on my outline. Let me just mention the other two before I deal with each of these individually. One of the things to do during a boom period like we are in now with a strong economy topped off by an oil boom is to figure out what to do when the oil boom part of that ends and make sure the engine keeps running. And one way to do that is to figure out a way to get rid of some taxes while the revenue is from the others. So for example, if we would restrain our growth to population plus inflation, restrain our rate of growth to population plus inflation, we wouldn't need franchise tax anymore, which is arguably the #1 anti-growth tax that Texas still has. And I'll get into the detail of that in a few minutes. And then kind of topping off on the semi-fiscal side of things, we now have a basis, perhaps with a Abbott and Patrick pro-school choice administration coming in to fairly judge the fiscal cost of school choice programs so that that doesn't gum up the potential consideration of these kinds of policies. All right, so back to the appraised value issue. In a static world, one could ask, well, how can we not reappraise property? Wouldn't that cost us a lot of taxable value and therefore with constant rates, a lot of revenue? And the answer is, I'll go back to that slide in a minute. I'm getting kind of out of order here in my presentation. I prefer not to read from slides. Someone asked me a few years ago when I proposed this, how can it not increase taxable value? Well, again, in a static world, that's true. Because if you just wait till it's resold, right, which is what you would do in an acquisition-based, no reappraisal-based system, there would be a lag before the thing increased in value. But if you stop reappraising, you stop taxing people for renovating their property. And with about a 3.5% or nearly 3.5% property tax rate, over 20 years, raising your taxes when you improve your property basically doubles the cost of renovation, especially exterior renovation that the appraiser can see, which affects your neighbor's property value as well. So in a dynamic world, there are ways that the increase in property value by not reappraising can make up for some of the lag in the increase in the value of property for when it's eventually resold. Okay, and also just telling owners that when you buy something, your taxes aren't going to go up because somebody else thinks it's worth more than you paid for it. That also increases the demand for property and increases the taxable value of it eventually when it's sold again at full market value. And last but not least, you all have probably experienced I don't want to go quite to what Keith said about the rule of capture, but it's basically just downright silly having people go in and protesting that somebody thinks their property's worth a lot and wringing their hands over, oh no, my property has increased in value, now what am I going to do? And going down and protesting it and walking past a cop to do that because people get so irate demanding that the appraisal value of their property be lowered. And because of that, the appraisal districts rationally underappraise property in order to hold down the number of protests. So for those three reasons, among others, there's likely no net loss in taxable value. And I did a statistical study in which I found that reappraising doesn't generate a net increase in taxable value. Okay, so let me go back to the previous slide and I mentioned some of these already, but run them by you again. In 2004, which is the last time I looked up, it was $276 million statewide cost to do this reappraising. If we eliminated reappraisal, we'd save nearly all of that. We'd only need to appraise things when they've been renovated or rebuilt, physically changed. Other than that, the property changes value only when it changes hands. And probably the key reason that more states haven't followed Oregon and California is that if you don't reappraise, identical properties aren't taxed at the same rate. And that seems so terribly unfair. But how about the unfairness of taxing somebody out of their property based on what somebody else thinks it's worth, which may be more than someone who paid for it, which may increase their taxes to more than they can pay. And then how fair is that? That you have to leave your property because your neighborhood is popular and the property values have gone up and your taxes have gone up and you can no longer pay them. So anyway, ending reappraisal substitutes more important fairness for less important fairness, and also ending reappraisal makes property tax revenue less volatile because it doesn't go up and down with cycles in the economy as much. And then again, the phrase at the bottom there, which is, huh? Are you known? Anyway, that's explained there, and I've gone over that. So moving on to what else we can learn from semi-blue states, right? Oregon and California, liberal states we can learn from. Colorado, off and on, red and blue, a somewhat liberal state, though they did reject control not too long ago, so bravo for that. But they're the only state in the country that has a remaining biting constitutional spending limit, namely state and local governments can increase their spending faster than population plus inflation. We can do them one better, though. One of the reasons that Colorado's weakened their tax expenditure limitation, their constitutional spending limit, their TABOR as it's popularly called, is they didn't include a budget stabilization fund in with it. So every time their revenue falls short of their spending cap, their spending ratchets down for all time, basically. And so because they were starting to fall behind a population plus inflation spending growth trend in 2005, they voted to suspend their tax expenditure limitation for a period of years, and only this year it's come back into effect. So if we had a budget stabilization fund taking surplus revenue from one year and putting it into account, and by the way, we do sort of have one in Texas called the economics, but it isn't a real budget stabilization fund because it's a combination of budget stabilization and emergency spending. And so as we heard the governor a couple of years ago say, you know, I really don't want to use much more than X for budget stabilization because I want to save most of it in case there's a hurricane. Whoops. We need to separate those two accounts and have a separate emergency fund from a budget stabilization fund and fund it. We could continue to fund it out of oil and gas revenue like we do now, or we could supplement that or replace that with just budget surpluses that will result if we cap spending growth at population plus inflation. And then there's the franchise tax dimension to it. I did a simulation that showed that if we had eliminated the franchise tax in 2005 in the 2005 legislature and at the same time imposed the spending growth cap at population inflation, we would have balanced the budget without the franchise tax revenue, needing only a 2% spending cut in the Great Recession, during which one of the 2 years there was a spending cut anyway of I think 3.9%. So by getting off the spending roller coaster, okay, saving surplus money from good growth years and spending it in low growth years, we could steadily increase spending by population plus inflation without a Great Recession every year and do without Texas's most anti-growth tax, namely the franchise tax. Third and last, in terms of something important to do and something that's critical fiscally as well as for our civilization, the need to improve education, school system reform efforts will be blessed not only by new leadership but by the ability to go to this website and enter a bunch of data and get an estimate for tuition vouchers or education savings accounts or tuition tax credits, and soon, after I upgrade the website a little bit, also tax credit scholarships. For any of those three, enter a bunch of data and it will spit out for you what the fiscal impact will be, positive or negative. And as I said, it's up and running, but it's fairly new. You've probably never heard of it, at that for 99.9% of you. But it needs some refinement. So if you go there and you play around with it, send me an email that says, John, why don't you do X, Y, and Z, and it'll be even better than it is now. And there's my email address. It'll be on one of the later slides as well. And last but not least, I don't know how I'm doing on time, as I haven't been paying attention, but this is my last slide. So let me mention one other thing that we can learn from three very blue liberal places. Sadly, very sadly, Texas doesn't even have a decent charter school law. Not even as good as California, Minnesota, or the District of Columbia. Can we all gasp in unison? Oh, District of Columbia has a better school chance law, actually, school choice law. Because, see, that's the problem with charter law. It's important to have one, but it's really more school chance than school choice, because without a price system, which is banned by charter law because it has to be free, we have massive waiting lists, and therefore if you get in when it's first announced, great, then it's a school choice. But once the announcement period is about 5 days old for most of these schools, the school is full and it has a waiting list. And so we need to end that. So we need to do even better than California, Minnesota, and District of Columbia. We need a charter law that allows for some form of top-off of the subsidy so that we don't need the Walton Family Fund and others to subsidize charter schools. Something Milton Friedman said should never be done. Subsidies should go to individual families trying to get in schools. Public or private subsidies. That's where we need the Walton Family Fund and other philanthropies. We need them to underwrite the top-off amount for vouchers or charter schools, if it was allowed, for low-income families, not to underwrite KIPP and other charter schools, which they have to do now to help, because how can you subsidize something that's free? Well, you can only subsidize the producer of it. There's some important websites. Please go to my blog and participate. There, and coming soon, including an academic journal, an education freedom index that you can punch in some data and find out how free your state or your country is. You can go to that website. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Merrifield. We now have almost 20 minutes of questions and answers. So this is now the part that you've all been waiting for, and I think we have a microphone that will float around, so please. Oh, well, that was the other panel. Do you have a burning question that you wish to? You want to be quizzed? Okay, well, I guess we can do that, unless the Federal Reserve Bank has any objections to that.
I have one for Keith real quick.
All right, fire away.
Keith, what do you think about the so-called no-injury doctrine, which affects reallocation of surface water, and the notion of politically overturning something that's called a no-injury doctrine? In other words, being tagged as being for injury.
Well, I think you're talking about third-party effects when
Yeah,
you,
stuff about compensating
in terms,
stores.
yeah, basin transfers. Richard works with Mike Cox, who's done a lot about just educating people on how capitalism works, that it's constantly destroys old jobs as it creates new jobs. So there's constantly third-party effects if we get increases in our standard of living, because it's kind of like asking cell phone companies to compensate companies that make pagers. So I think, there's been a long-term decline in rural areas. We know that. There's been a urbanization of the state's economy, not necessarily because farming is less important. It's because it's become more efficient. And because of the mechanization of farms, a lot of the jobs went away that were very bad jobs, actually, where you toil and sweat in fields to pick crops. And when those machinery companies innovated the way we farm, we didn't ask those companies to pay retail outlets in small counties because there was no longer the labor there to buy their products. I think I'm not, as you might guess from my rambling thus far, I'm not a big supporter of paying for third-party effects. The fact is the economy is always changing as we innovate and change how we produce and what we produce. And the kind of third-party effects, paying third parties because things are changing, is kind of has the assumption behind it that the economy is stagnant. So anyway, that's my view on that.
Or that there's a right to a stagnant economy.
Yeah.
Let's hear it. The right to economic stagnation. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, we can't change.
Yeah.
If you want me to change, pay me.
Any other questions among the panelists before we do you want to retaliate, Doctor?
I think he explained everything perfectly.
Okay, very good. All right, we do have a microphone. If you wish to address the panelists, please raise your hand and then wait for the microphone to come to you so that we can all hear your question. In the back.
Dr. Phillips, you mentioned groundwater, but you didn't mention the rate of depletion. I understand there are quite a few wells around this area that are running dry. Is that something you're aware of? Or?
Yeah, so, right. So there's scarcity in both surface water and groundwater. And the problem is that we have generally have no private property rights to groundwater. And so if you don't have markets, there's no incentive for efficiency. So you're going to see more and more of a draining of the aquifers unless we can somehow establish private property rights. Certainly we're having trouble all over the state in terms of water scarcity. But, what highlights this is kind of the catfish farmer story in San Antonio, if you're familiar with that, where there are some artesian wells north of San Antonio that there was a catfish farmer that was consuming about 25% of the amount of water the whole city of San Antonio consumed. And essentially there was no way to stop him. They stopped him temporarily by his discharge. Obviously, if you're pumping that much water, you're discharging into streams. But there was no private property rights to the water, so anybody can just drain the water. When I gave that speech in West Texas, you know, the Ogallala is more like a lake, the Edwards is more like a river. But when I gave that speech out there and I argued that unless you have rights to a certain amount of the water, then your neighbors can just take all the water. And the guy was very upset with me. But later on, when T. Boone Pickens said he was going to build a pipeline from West Texas to San Antonio and sell the water, things changed pretty quickly. I think he understood the private property right argument. So it's, you know, in the old, you know, I made a joke about the rule of capture sucks, but really, when you have plenty of availability and very little scarcity, the rule of capture is fine. There's less involvement from government and less, because private property rights cost something. You have to have enforcement. So when there's plenty of availability, it's kind of like oxygen. No one regulates how much we breathe because there's plenty of oxygen floating around. And as long as you don't have any scarcity, you don't have to have markets. But once scarcity comes around, it begins that the more you conserve, the more your neighbor benefits instead of you benefiting. Then there's a problem. And so we have to put new laws in place that allocate these private property rights to groundwater so that the water is used efficiently and it won't drain. As it comes down, the price of it goes up, and then people begin to use it more efficiently. You know, flood irrigation has been part of the history of Texas agriculture simply because there was plenty of water. But if the price of water goes up, you can install irrigation systems and you can sell the rest of the water to cities and stuff. So this doesn't address the certain areas where wells are drying up, but it addresses the general issue of, as scarcity becomes greater, how we can allocate it efficiently. Prices should increase. And as prices increase, people become very innovative in the use of the product. So we are facing issues. You know, San Antonio has the Edwards Aquifer, and it has lots of water, but it can't use much of it because of the blind salamander. So we're very limited in how much we can use because as it tops off, you know, the flows into the San Marcos and Comal streams start to drop, and the blind salamander dries up or whatever he does. And so, you know, it's created scarcity. And now that we have the scarcity mandated, we have to deal with the scarcity. And so the Edwards Aquifer Authority has been trying to set up private property rights to the water so that farmers can sell water, and you don't have to steal water from farmers. Everyone benefits in markets because you have willing buyers and sellers. So anyway, that's a general solution to this issue, is as scarcity goes up, prices go up. Not we just stick in a straw and drink it till it's dry. Essentially, you don't run out of water. It just becomes more and more expensive as scarcity increases.
All righty then. Any other up front here?
Dr. Murray, what would you do?
Wait, please wait for the microphone there. Then oh, no, come on. We're recording this, sir. You want to be recorded for posterity.
A question on the appraisals, getting rid of them. Would you then move to sale price being
Yeah,
the
that's the
appraisal?
alternative to it, is to base the assessed value for tax purposes on the selling price of the property.
And what about industrial property?
I know nothing about commercial or industrial property taxes, so I'm talking strictly residential.
So you need a law to allow appraisal districts now to collect sale price.
Right, you would need to change that law here in Texas to collect that. Somehow they seem to have that. I mean, I know they don't have the authority to it, But they knew right away what I bought my house for, even though I didn't tell them. They found it someplace.
Thank you for Dr. Ullman, Dr. Merrifield. A tough question. We're involved with Kairos Prison Ministries and some drug clinic boards and all sorts of things. If there's one thing we've discovered about, depending on the prison or the drug clinic, 70 to 90% of everyone there comes from single-parent households. And while you're talking about many interesting things, how do we deal with the fact that, as you said, the problem's parents? Even with choice schools, you know, we see it in big cities, whether it's Detroit, Milwaukee, Chicago, LA, Harlem. You know, they give them choice, and guess what? They still send them to the crappy public school. How do you deal with the parent? And I mean, I don't have an answer. I'm asking. I can't figure it out either.
Some of that started in the so-called Great Society, where we provided an incentive for households to disintegrate themselves. So that's kind of a short answer to something that deserves a lot more analysis than that. But at the very least, if we can create a school system that has a dynamic array of diverse offerings that are as diverse as our children, then at least the children can have some chance of being engaged in the schooling process that exists somewhere for them to use. Right now, that's the problem with the public school system. One size doesn't fit all. Now, we've heard that a lot, but that means that we can't assign people to children to schools based on where they live. Otherwise, we're going to lose a large percentage of them. And that's why I made my comment when I first got up. Even the best school system in the country has 40 to 50 to 60% below proficiency. Okay, so we can rank them and say so-and-so's number one, but so-and-so not being number one still SUCKS.
I'm beginning to think that word is a technical term of art in economics.
It caught
The, one of the nice things about markets is I think that you don't necessarily have to be, in other words, you're asking whether parents will make good choices, basically, of what school to send their child to. Well, what happens in markets is the bad ones get weeded out, and you don't have to be an expert in a telephone or a car. Like, I don't know anything about running a car, but cars have gotten better in the last 40 years. You know, in other words, products improve through markets and become cheaper through markets, even though each individual doesn't necessarily know how to know everything he needs to know about making a choice, because you weed out the inefficient and the ineffective. So I presume that the array of educational choices would improve over.
It wouldn't just improve, it would diversify. That's what we need, is not a one-dimensional notion of better or worse. The quality of a school should be followed by the term for whom. Any given school can be great for someone, like most public schools are great for many of the kids in them. They're just not great for all the kids in them, because one size doesn't fit all.
We have a question up here.
Gentlemen, both you and the first panel, this has really been great. And I tend to be a macro thinker. As an old guy, I'm fascinated by how involved I am in education policy. I feel really strong about it. And there's a couple of things that have not been mentioned today, but on the education side, I recently read a comment by a university president that going back to Socrates, there was a fundamental core of education, and that is, how should a man live? And in advancing forward, you know, that the Judeo-Christian principles follow that. But in today's, one of the things about the Common Core education this same man mentioned was, how should a man live? Or character development is totally absent from Common Core education, and I see that more and more in our society. Morality, you know, a faith in God, a religious conviction has been removed, and the only thing that counts in today's public education, and my wife and I are volunteers in public schools, and when you walk the halls of public schools, you see a whole lot of college banners, college, education, that's all that counts. And even the trades kind of don't see, college is all that counts in making money, and that's not what makes life. And so that's an additional factor. And the comments you're making about school choice and schools is just excellent. Both of you gentlemen are just excellent. You've said so much very good. But I just want to add that element that we, and on top of that, the fall of the dollar and our just totally financial policy of the United States,
let me
that sucks,
preface
as
that
you
for
say. That's a big factor. We need economic development, and the kids need to learn hard work and moving forward.
So regarding the Common Core and how then should you live, to Dr. Merrifield and Mr. Alm, isn't it true that if you have a diverse offering of schools, that if that is true, and it probably is, given the millennia of experience, that perhaps the offerings that have that would actually perform better than the schools that don't?
Absolutely. A perfect preface to my comment that I was kind of formulating as he spoke. You're not going to get those issues addressed by politically correct schooling. Okay? Public schooling is by definition politically correct schooling. That's not ever going to teach morality or values.
And morality and values are behind the trend in homeschooling and much parochial schooling and all that. So there's a demand for it, for sure.
You're not going to get it in a public system.
Right. More questions? We've got some time for more questions. I know that there are some burning questions out there. Don't, be brave. Don't be bashful.
You've provided all the answers.
Yeah.
All right, let me throw one at.
See, they got it.
My question is for Mr. Phillips. Regarding the policy changes EU recommended, is there, if there were to be a bill that was filed and pushed forward on in the legislature, what would be the 3 to 5 things that would be most important to see in it?
Well, once again, I think we should establish private property rights for groundwater. I think the rule of capture is not something that's embedded in a constitution. I think it's fairly easy to change. So we need to, what's good about it is that we now know a lot about how different areas of the country have dealt with private property rights to water. And we can kind of start on a footing where we set it up in a very efficient way. We need very clear rights to water. And since we need lots of buyers and sellers, I think land ought to be a part of the equation. In San Antonio, the Edwards Aquifer Authority is set up rights and recently been legally challenged because of people buying land and wanting to create a winery, and suddenly they find out they can't pump any water because they don't have any water rights. So part of the equation of rights should be the amount of land above the aquifer, I think. So I think a key provision would be to work toward to get rid of the rule of capture and establish private property rights to groundwater. I think instead of moving toward bigger and bigger government control through these river authorities and such, that they need to move toward more and more private property owners who have rights to the waters. So instead of, like I said, the Colorado River Authority deciding this use of water is better than this use of water, if you have a bunch of people who own the water, they can decide if they want to sell it. And the marginal value of a gallon of water to a rice farmer is, I would assume, very little compared to industry or metropolitan areas. And so there can be a market there where they can sell that water, and the price will give proper incentives to both sides. So I think this ought to be a part of the legislation where you work toward more and more buyers and sellers and clearly define property rights in both surface and groundwater.
Great. Well, that was the last question. We need to wrap up our panel now, or else we'll be late for lunch, and I'll never hear the end of it. So we run a very tight ship at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We thank you very much for attending the last two panels, and we look forward to our lunch. I think that the one common theme that you've heard here is how free markets, how competition and free enterprise can improve prosperity by allocating scarce resources, and that Texas ought to apply these principles more broadly. One of the things that I think we often forget as Texans is just how well we are doing as a state compared to other states, but somehow we often wall off from discussion or consideration applying the principles, the very same principles that have made Texas so successful, more broadly across different public policy sectors within the state of Texas. And so here I think you've heard how the principles of free markets can be applied more broadly and how they can improve the lives of everyone in the state of Texas. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to bring the second panel to a close. A round of applause for our panelists, please.